In the heart of Chicago, where the skyscrapers reflected the morning sun's shine, Marcus Bennett entered the bank that bore his surname. Bennett Financial was more than a high-end financial institution. It was the embodiment of his hard work, a symbol of overcoming in a city where few people like him made it so far. That day, however, Marcus was not there as CEO. No meetings, no strategic agendas, no journalists waiting for statements. He simply wanted to make a personal withdrawal of $15,000, a simple process that any premium client should be able to complete without difficulty. Wearing a button-up shirt, khaki pants, and clean sneakers, he blended in among the clients filling the agency's lobby. While waiting in line, Marcus noticed a middle-aged white man wearing a smart gray blazer, being attended to without delay. The client asked for $20,000 in cash, and the blonde woman on the other side of the counter, Amy Carter, smiled while counting the bills without question. The scene didn't surprise him, only mildly bothered him. He knew the subtleties of the corporate world well. When his turn came, the difference in treatment was immediate. Without a smile, not even a good morning, Amy slid a form in his direction and said in a dry tone that he would need to fill it out before anything could be done. Marcus remained calm, but he noticed the silent message in the way the attendant looked at him. To her, he didn't belong there. Marcus filled out the form without complaint. His name, address, account number, requested amount. Everything was correct. He slid the paper back to Amy, along with his identification. She took the papers slowly, glanced over them quickly, and without even checking the details in the system, pushed everything back toward him. "We can't process this," she said, her voice laden with disinterest. Marcus frowned. "Why?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Amy didn't look him in the eye when she answered. "The bank doesn't make such large cash withdrawals," she said, as if repeating a standard policy. But Marcus had already seen with his own eyes that this wasn't true. He pointed to the man who had been attended to before him. "He just withdrew $20,000, he said calmly. Amy hesitated for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. "That's different," she replied, without offering any explanation. Marcus took a deep breath. He had faced this type of situation before, and he knew that if he got upset, the narrative would turn against him in the blink of an eye. But he also knew that giving in to silence meant accepting that unfair game. "Different how?" he insisted, still keeping his voice low. Amy finally lifted her eyes to him, but didn't respond. Instead, her gaze shifted toward the office in the back, where the bank manager, Victoria Sanders, watched the interaction with an unreadable expression. It was a brief moment, but enough for Marcus to understand exactly what was happening. Marcus noticed the brief exchange of looks between Amy and Victoria. It wasn't a request for guidance, it wasn't an operational doubt. It was a silent confirmation of something that had already been decided before he even approached the counter. He knew what would come next. Amy, trying to maintain professionalism, leaned on the counter and repeated the refusal, this time with an even vaguer justification. "Security policy," she said. "For amounts over a certain limit, we need additional verifications." Marcus crossed his arms. "And what's that limit?" he asked. Amy hesitated. "It depends," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Depends on what?" Her discomfort increased, but before she was forced to tangle herself up even more, Victoria finally decided to intervene. The manager stepped out from behind the bulletproof glass and walked toward the counter with calculated steps. Tall, well-dressed, with the confidence of someone accustomed to exercising power, Victoria positioned herself next to Amy and looked at Marcus as if she were analyzing a problem to be solved. "We can process your request, Mr. Bennett," she began in a soft tone, though heavy with condescension. "But we need to follow our internal protocols. If you want to withdraw this amount, we will need a second form of identification and verification of the source of the funds." Marcus kept his expression impassive. He knew that was a fabrication. His money had been in that account for years, always moved in accordance with banking rules. He could have argued right then, pointed out the obvious hypocrisy, but he didn't want to play their game on their terms. Instead, he prepared for the next step. Marcus pulled out his wallet and, without looking away from Victoria, retrieved a second document. His driver's license was there intact, with the same name and address linked to the bank account. He placed it on the counter next to the ID Amy had already returned with disdain. "Here it is," he simply said. Victoria didn't even try to hide her surprise. She hadn't expected him to have the documentation on hand, much less to respond so calmly. But even with all that they had demanded in front of them, Amy and Victoria did not move. The transaction was not processed. The papers remained untouched on the counter, as if ignoring them would make them cease to exist. The silence between the three grew heavy. Some clients began to pay attention to the interaction, noticing that something strange was happening. "Is there anything else you'd like to invent?" Marcus asked, his patience running out. Victoria maintained the corporate smile, the one that hid contempt behind a mask of professionalism. "The decision has been made, Mr. Bennett. We cannot release this amount at this time." It was at that moment that Marcus understood that no matter how many documents he presented or how many procedures he followed to the letter, they had decided that he wouldn't leave with that money, because to them, he didn't deserve the same treatment as other clients. The problem wasn't security, it wasn't protocols. The problem was who he was. But if they thought he would just accept it silently, they were very wrong. Marcus took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. If they were willing to ignore their own rules to make his life harder, he could also use the tools at his disposal. With a simple tap on the screen, he began recording. "I'm at Bennett Financial, a bank where I've had an account for years. My name is Marcus Bennett. I'm trying to withdraw $15,000 from my own account, following all the requirements that were presented to me. Still, the manager Victoria Sanders and the attendant Amy Carter are refusing to release the amount without any valid justification. Is this discrimination?" His voice was controlled, firm, without traces of anger or loss of control, but the tension in the agency rose instantly. Some clients looked at him, others pretended not to see. Victoria stiffened her shoulders, visibly annoyed by the recording. Amy turned away, pretending to shuffle some papers. It was then that Victoria made the decision that would change everything. Without saying a word, she turned to the agency's security guard, Ethan Reynolds, a large white man who had been watching the situation from a distance. It took only one look for him to begin moving toward Marcus. His stride was determined, his face serious. He didn't need any explanations to know what was expected of him. Marcus saw the movement and already knew how this scene would unfold. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't made any threats, he posed no risk, but still, he would be treated as a problem to be removed. The pattern was always the same. The protocol wasn't banking, it was racial. The silence in the agency was broken by the firm sound of Ethan's boots against the marble floor. He approached Marcus with the certainty that there would be no resistance. To him, this was just another workday. A black man questioning something he shouldn't, being treated as a threat despite posing no danger at all. Marcus kept the phone pointed forward, recording every second. "Are you really going to do this?" he asked, looking directly at the security guard. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he stopped beside him, imposing his presence. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, in a deep voice trained to sound authoritative. Marcus didn't move. And why? For following the bank's procedures? This time, Ethan looked to Victoria, awaiting instructions. She didn't need to say anything. The message had already been given. The heavy hand of the security guard landed on Marcus's arm. The gesture was quick, without explicit violence, but loaded with meaning. It was a removal disguised as protocol, an expulsion under the pretext that he was causing problems. But Marcus didn't react the way they expected. Instead of resisting, he just raised his voice enough for everyone around to hear. "They're removing me from my own bank, even though I'm a customer, even though I followed all the requirements. Did anyone here see me do anything wrong? The impact was immediate. Some people lowered their heads, uncomfortable. Others pretended to be distracted. But a middle-aged white woman stopped counting the money she had just withdrawn and stared fixedly at the scene. Lisa Parker saw everything unfold. She saw how the other man, white and wearing a suit, received his money without any problem. And now she saw Marcus being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. But like so many before her, Lisa remained silent. The grip on Marcus's arm tightened slightly, a silent warning that his presence was no longer welcome. He let out a short sigh, showing no fear or hesitation, and put the phone back in his pocket. Not because he had given up recording what was happening, but because he already knew what needed to be done. When Ethan tried to pull him away from the counter, Marcus didn't resist, just looked at him with a neutral expression and said, "If I were a white man, would you be doing this?" The question lingered in the air for a second, and Marcus realized the exact moment when Ethan hesitated. Not because he doubted the answer, but because he couldn't admit it. "Let's go, sir," was all the security guard could say before pushing him toward the exit. When Marcus crossed the bank's doors, he felt the fresh air hit his face. He wasn't surprised by what had happened, but that didn't make the situation any less infuriating. His ID fell to the ground in the middle of the confusion, carelessly thrown aside. Before he could bend down to pick it up, another hand did so first. "Here," said a low voice, offering the document back. It was Jamal Brooks, one of the bank's security guards, a black man like him. There was exhaustion in Jamal's eyes, a kind of weariness Marcus knew well. "This place always does this," he muttered, shaking his head. There was no need for more words. The look exchanged between the two said everything. Marcus took the ID back, nodded in thanks, and pulled out his phone again. But this time, he wasn't recording. He was calling. Marcus didn't hesitate as he dialed David Carter's number. David was one of the bank's most influential executives, and he knew exactly what was going on. Marcus didn't need to explain everything in detail. The situation was clear. When the phone rang, David's voice was direct, without surprise. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said, without hesitation. It wasn't a question, it was a certainty. The call ended quickly. Marcus was no longer concerned with what was happening inside the bank. He knew the battle was just beginning, but now things were about to change. David Carter wasn't just a high-level executive. He was someone who knew how to move the gears inside that institution. And now he was coming to deliver justice. About 15 minutes later, a black car parked in front of Bennett Financial. Marcus watched from afar as David Carter stepped out of the vehicle with firm steps. He wasn't wearing a suit, but his posture exuded a confidence that no outfit could hide. As David approached the bank's doors, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Ethan, who had seemed sure of his position before, straightened up upon seeing who was arriving. Inside the bank, Victoria froze when she realized who it was. She didn't immediately know what was happening, but she certainly knew who David Carter was. And it was at that moment that she understood the gravity of the situation. David walked into the bank without slowing down, going directly to meet Marcus, who was waiting outside the automatic doors. When their eyes met, there was no need for explanations or introductions. David had known Marcus for years. Together, they had built not only that financial institution, but a relationship based on respect and trust. David's face was serious, his expression carrying a tone of indignation mixed with disbelief, as if he were seeing something he had never imagined witnessing in that environment. Before Marcus could say anything, David spoke, his voice firm and loud enough for everyone inside the agency to hear clearly. "If you knew who you were serving, this wouldn't have happened," he said sharply. Victoria, sensing the gravity of the situation, tried to approach quickly, putting back on the polite smile she always used to handle important executives. But at that moment, the smile didn't work anymore. David raised his hand in a clear and authoritative gesture, interrupting any attempt she made to downplay what had happened. "Not a word," he warned coldly. Victoria stood still, surprised by the intensity of his reaction. David wasn't willing to listen to half-baked excuses or last-minute invented policies. His gaze slowly scanned the room, examining each employee and each client still present, watching in silence. The tension was palpable. Ethan Reynolds had stepped back, as if trying to disappear from the scene without drawing attention, aware of the gravity of what he had done just minutes earlier. Without raising his voice, David began to question Victoria and Amy, who remained behind the counter. His questions were direct and uncomfortable. Why had they denied Marcus the withdrawal? Why had they invented non-existent rules? And especially, why didn't those requirements apply to the previous client? With each question, Victoria tried to formulate an excuse, but none of them stood up to the slightest logical analysis. David quickly pointed out the contradictions, making it clear that the procedure adopted against Marcus had no backing in the official rules of the institution. Around them, other clients began to pay attention to the dialogue, now exposed to the light of truth. Some finally understood the blatant injustice Marcus had suffered before their eyes, which until then they had preferred to ignore. At one point, Victoria lowered her head, unable to answer the incisive questions. Her rigid, arrogant posture began to unravel. Amy, beside her, seemed scared, realizing that the situation had completely gotten out of control. David wasn't there to negotiate or discuss invented policies. He was there to clarify a serious situation that had occurred inside a bank that prided itself on combating situations like this. When he turned to Marcus again, his look was one of deep sorrow, a silent apology for what had happened under his supervision, even though indirectly. Marcus merely nodded without anger, but aware of the importance of that moment, because it wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who might go through the same thing in that place. David then turned back to Victoria, his expression firm but serene. The manager, once so secure in her position, was now cornered, unable to articulate any valid argument to justify her discriminatory decision. She still tried to claim she had made a mistake, that everything was a misunderstanding, that maybe there had been some communication error between the team. But her words sounded empty, desperate to cover up the obvious fact that she had allowed prejudices to influence the service of the most important customer of that institution. Next to her, Amy seemed about to cry, realizing too late the consequences of her prejudiced stance. David made it clear that this wasn't just an administrative issue, it was something that directly attacked the core values of the bank and the integrity of the company. Outside, Marcus remained calm, observing the scene. He had seen that type of reaction many times in his life, but had never imagined facing it inside his own bank. His face showed no anger, just a deep and silent disappointment. He reflected on everything he had gone through to build Bennett Financial, all the barriers he had to break to get to where he was, and still being treated with suspicion inside his own space. Marcus couldn't help but think of how many other people, less protected by position or power, faced this type of treatment daily without ever getting justice. This reflection gave him clarity on the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. David, sensing the heavy silence that had settled after the failed attempts at justification, firmly announced the immediate measures that would be taken. Victoria was fired at that moment, with no room for argument. Her permissive and discriminatory posture had crossed all acceptable limits by the company's ethics. Amy and Ethan would immediately be sent for rigorous training on racial biases and proper professional conduct. Other employees who had participated in or witnessed similar discrimination would also be investigated and formally warned. David was determined to make it clear that the bank would not tolerate, under any circumstances, any client, especially someone like Marcus, being treated that way again. Marcus watched the scene in silence. He didn't feel satisfaction from Victoria's firing, only sadness at realizing that prejudice still existed, even under his nose. At the same time, he noticed small signs of hope among the people around him. Some clients who had previously pretended not to see were now looking at him with a mix of guilt and respect, perhaps finally understanding that they had witnessed a serious situation. It was a powerful reminder that injustice is not perpetuated only by the hands of those who practice it directly, but also by the silence of those who, even when they see everything happening, choose to look away. He knew that this episode was a warning, not only for the employees of that agency, but for everyone present, and for him as well. David wasted no time after announcing the decision. He immediately turned to Ethan Reynolds, the security guard who had removed Marcus from the bank minutes earlier. Ethan seemed lost, trying to absorb the impact of what had just happened. Once so sure of himself, his face was now marked by evident discomfort. David got straight to the point, clearly stating that Ethan would have to go through rigorous training on racial prejudice and how to properly deal with customers. The security guard lowered his eyes, aware that there was no justification for how he had treated Marcus. Beside him was Jamal Brooks, the black security guard who had treated Marcus with respect from the very beginning. Jamal remained silent, watching the scene, clearly emotional about the outcome he was witnessing. When David turned his attention to him, it was to do something unexpected and powerful. David announced loudly so everyone could hear clearly, "Jamal, from now on, you are the new security supervisor at this branch." The announcement surprised the employees, but also created a sense of justice among the clients present. Jamal, caught completely off guard, could barely hide his shock mixed with joy. For years he had witnessed similar scenes, having to keep quiet to preserve his job. Now, in that moment, he felt finally recognized and valued by someone with enough power to change things. Marcus watched Jamal discreetly, seeing in the man's eyes something he understood very well, the feeling of dignity finally restored, even amid pain. It was a small victory, but extremely significant, signaling that the fight was worth it. After quickly resolving those internal issues, David turned back to face Marcus. This time his look was different. There was something more than the usual respect. There was admiration for how Marcus had handled that difficult situation. With a gesture, he invited Marcus to return to the counter to complete the withdrawal that had been wrongly denied. This time, there was no resistance, no questions, no distrust. Amy, trembling and visibly ashamed, was counting the bills quickly, carefully placing them on the counter. Marcus watched her hands move without saying a word, noticing how the same fingers that had previously pushed his documents were now trembling while counting each bill. In that moment, Marcus realized how that simple act represented something much greater. It was the symbolic recognition that he should never have gone through that situation, especially in a place built by him. As Amy finished counting the bills, Marcus gave a silent glance at Victoria, who remained still, devastated by the shame of being exposed in front of everyone. He didn't feel pleasure in her humiliation, only a slight sense of justice, seeing that the truth had finally prevailed. Victoria avoided looking directly at him, as if her pride prevented her from admitting the mistake she had made. Marcus, however, didn't need a verbal apology. The acknowledgement of the mistake was already written on the face of the woman who, just minutes earlier, had felt entitled to expel him from his own bank. Amy finally finished counting the bills, carefully organizing them on the counter, avoiding looking at Marcus as much as possible. Her hands were shaking slightly, a reflection of the tension that had built up over the last few minutes. When she was done, she carefully pushed the stacks toward him, this time without any resistance. Marcus looked at the bills for a moment, realizing how insignificant that money seemed compared to the humiliation he had suffered. He didn't feel anger toward Amy personally. The feeling that predominated in him was sadness for realizing how ignorance still reigned even in seemingly evolved environments. Marcus took the stacks calmly, counting them quickly, not out of distrust, but as a silent assertion that he was there by right, not as a favor or concession. It was his money, the result of his hard work, now finally handed over after a completely unnecessary humiliation. When he finished putting the money away, Marcus looked one last time at Jamal, the black security guard who had treated him with respect from the very first moment. Jamal remained beside Ethan, still silent, his eyes subtly shining with tears of emotion and pride at the outcome of the situation. Marcus then set aside one of the stacks of bills and with a firm gesture slid it gently toward Jamal. "Take the day off," he said softly, in a warm, supportive tone. Jamal hesitated for a second, visibly surprised by the unexpected generosity, but he quickly understood that it wasn't charity, but a profound acknowledgement, a way for Marcus to show that he saw him not just as an employee, but as someone who shared in a daily struggle that few people understood. Before leaving the bank, Marcus turned one last time to Victoria Sanders, the woman who had tried to humiliate him just minutes earlier. Her face, once firm and authoritative, was now marked by the slump of defeat. There were no words that could fix what had happened, but Marcus felt the need to say something, not out of revenge, but so that the episode wouldn't be forgotten so easily. "You should have looked at my document properly," Marcus said calmly, not raising his voice. His tone held no anger, but a deep sense of warning. "Maybe then you wouldn't have made a mistake that cost you your job." Victoria lowered her eyes, unable to hold his gaze. Marcus took a deep breath, realizing that her silence was the most sincere acknowledgement he could receive at that moment. With that, Marcus left the building with firm steps, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He wasn't happy about what he had to do that day, nor satisfied that someone had lost their job. But he knew that situations like that required immediate and courageous responses. His calm and assertive stance had dismantled a discrimination that had probably happened many times before in that same place, against others who didn't have the strength or resources to react. Marcus realized that this episode wasn't just a personal confrontation. It was a clear message about power, prejudice, and justice. A message that needed to be seen and heard to generate reflection and change. Outside the bank, Marcus paused for a moment, looking at the building he had built himself, feeling a mix of emotions hard to describe. It was a strange feeling to realize that, even being at the top of his career, with an impeccable reputation and respected by many, he was still vulnerable to situations like that. The feeling was bitter, yet enlightening. For the first time in a long time, he was forced to remember that for many, his position didn't matter. The color of his skin was still enough to make him suspicious, unwanted, or inadequate in certain spaces. The humiliation didn't just come from being forcibly removed. It came from the fact that none of his achievements seemed enough to prevent that treatment from happening again. As he thought about this, he heard the sound of the automatic doors opening behind him, bringing back the weight of that morning's reality. He turned around and saw David Carter walking toward him with a serious yet empathetic expression. David placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder, a simple gesture, but one full of meaning. "I'm sorry, Marcus. Really, it shouldn't have been like this." Marcus simply nodded, understanding that David was sincere, but knowing he could never fully comprehend the pain of that experience. David continued, in a lower, almost introspective tone, "I thought we were beyond this, but clearly we need to look inside more carefully. What happened today can't happen again." Marcus sighed deeply, recognizing in David's sincerity a chance for real change within that institution. Across the street, some people were still discreetly watching the movement, curious to understand what had happened. Among them was Lisa Parker, the same client who had witnessed the entire scene inside the agency but hadn't said a word in defense of Marcus. Now, seeing the bank executive embrace Marcus with a public gesture of solidarity, Lisa felt a pang of guilt in her chest. She could have said something, could have intervened, but remained silent as so many others had done in the face of similar injustices. At that moment, she realized that her silence was part of the problem. Marcus had faced it all alone, without any support from the ordinary people around him. Lisa felt shame and lowered her eyes, reflecting on how many times she had witnessed similar injustices without ever speaking up. She understood, for the first time, that not taking a side was also taking a side, and decided at that moment that she would never stay silent again in the future. Marcus didn't notice Lisa's silent reflection, but he felt something had changed within him after that experience. He knew that his attitude, though firm and courageous, wouldn't completely solve the issue of systemic discrimination, but perhaps it was a first step. He couldn't control how people saw him, but he could ensure that within that bank, no one would ever be treated that way again. It was time to act firmly to make sure that this kind of situation never happened again to anyone, regardless of color, class, or social position. Marcus walked slowly toward the parking lot, feeling the tension gradually ease. The weight of that experience still followed him, but he now also carried a new clarity about himself and the world around him. He knew he had won that specific battle, but he was aware that the war against prejudice was far from over. He could hear, in the back of his mind, Jamal's words echoing, "This place always does this." Those words deeply bothered him. How many other places still did that? How many other black men and women had to go through similar situations every day without being able to react or even complain? Marcus realized at that moment that this situation had clearly shown him his mission from here on out. It wasn't enough just to build institutions and achieve personal success. He needed to use his power and influence to create real change, ensuring that no one else ever had to go through that kind of humiliation again. When he got into the car, Marcus took a deep breath and started the engine, ready to leave that troubled morning behind. But before he could accelerate, he saw Jamal quickly crossing the street, coming toward him. Marcus lowered the window, curious about the unexpected approach of the newly promoted security guard. With a shy smile, Jamal gave a discreet hand gesture, and as he approached, said something Marcus would never forget. "Thank you for not giving up. You have no idea how much this meant to me." In that moment, Marcus felt a genuine emotion fill his chest. The sincere gratitude in Jamal's eyes reinforced something essential inside him. It wasn't just about money, position, or power. It was about dignity. He smiled back at Jamal, nodding silently in mutual recognition. As he pulled away in the car, Marcus realized that this difficult day had a greater purpose, a lesson he would never forget. As long as injustice exists, he needed to keep fighting, using his voice and influence to ensure no one ever went through the same situation again.